The Fairfax County Jane Doe, 1993, identified as Sharon K. Abbott Lane. I actually covered this case as a Jane Doe about 6 months ago, so it's always kind of exciting to see when they solve it. In December of 1993, a land surveyor was working in a wooded area of Centerville, Virginia. This area was being cut down and converted into a subdivision. And in the process, a woman's skeletal remains were found between the trees. It was eventually determined that she'd been there about 1 to 6 years, although one source lists it as being up to 15 years. Though we know now that 3 to 6 years is likely how long it was. The young woman had teeth that were in pretty poor shape. She had some cosmetic filler applied to a space, and it looks like they'd been cared for up to a point. So then something changed for her along the way. By the end, they were in pretty bad disrepair. She had an overbite and 5 missing molars. There was a lot of staining and a gap in the front. She was also likely a heavy smoker. The underwear she had on had a rip, and her bra was found rolled up next to her. She had been wearing a size 8 pair of sandals, and she did have on some jewelry. She had with her a hair pick and a banana clip. Banana clips were crescent-shaped hair clips that would give the wearer's hair volume and cause it to fan out. A quarter found in her pocket was made in 1980. It was noted that she'd suffered knife wounds to her back, collarbone, and neck. It's thought that it might have possibly been an attack from behind. The digital quality of the recreations that were done were pretty terrible. As time has gone by, they are basically copies of copies. But over the years, starting in 1999, a 3-dimensional likeness of her face was shown to the media. Despite this, no one came forward missing her or thought that they could identify her. It turns out that Sharon K. Abbott Lane was the mother of 2 kids. She would have been around 34 if she'd lived to the year that she was found, which most likely means she was 28 to 31 when her life was taken. She'd been raised in Indiana, eventually living at one point in Big Stone Gap, Virginia. She was 16 when she had her first child, and her second child would arrive when she was 19. But Sharon was also inclined to do drugs, and she had a tendency to hang out with the wrong people. This sadly led to Sharon losing custody of her kids at age 20, when the kids were aged 1 to 4. The oldest child, her daughter, recalls her mother calling her out of the blue in the mid-1980s, when she would have been around 8 to 10 years old. Up until that point, she'd had almost no contact with her mother. During that call, Sharon asked her daughter Kimberly if she loved her, and asked if the two could stay in touch. She would then give Kimberly her number. Kimberly would mention that she put her mom's number in a pocketbook, and she carried it around with her for the next few years. Which is pretty heartbreaking to think of a child doing this, and probably how hurt she felt when her mother never called again. Kim believes it was Fairfax County her mother commented that she was living in, and this was also the area she was found in. Her daughter Kimberly would say that she always thought she'd hear from her once she was an adult, but that again didn't happen. Her son would also try to locate her at one point, and he couldn't find any record of her. Othram Labs would use DNA to come up with a cousin of Sharon's, which eventually led to Sharon's brother. They usually look for 2 different DNA donors to positively identify a Jane or John Doe. Sharon's brother told the authorities that Sharon's kids, Michael and Kimberly, lived in Virginia. It was a little bit of a stretch finding the right Kimberly, but they located her, and as a result, they obtained her DNA. And with this, she was officially confirmed as once again having her name. This happened in December of 2022. Kimberly would explain that she doesn't really know much about her mom, but that she heard some stories from her dad, saying their mother was really young and kind of wild and around the wrong people. He felt it wasn't safe for the kids to stay with their mom. She then recounted a memory she had of trying to feed her crying baby brother cereal when they were alone in an apartment. It isn't stated for this incident how old the kids were, but the oldest she would have been was about 4, and her brother either a baby or a toddler. Her parents had split up by then, and the kids were thankfully sent to live with their father. Michael, for his part, has no memories of his mom at all. He always had a bad feeling about what might have happened to her, saying he would much rather finally know what happened rather than being left to wonder. He looked into finding her at one point, saying he contacted her family over the years, but they hadn't heard from her either. On one of the calls, he got in contact with his grandfather, who relayed that the last time they had spoken to Sharon was in 1987. On this occasion, she had called to ask for bail money, but the father refused. Another time, he spoke to one of Sharon's sisters. She told Michael that in 1991, she received a call in the middle of the night with someone screaming, "Your sister's dead." It doesn't appear that the sister called the police or anything. It left Michael with the impression that no one ever filed a missing person report at all. I always struggle if I should say what I think, and I've had some negative comments when I have. But people also ask me what I think, and in this case, I feel like I have to say how I think. Usually, I work really hard not to cast blame. They paid for any of their mistakes with their life, and usually it's a far higher price than anyone should have had to pay. And it's true for Sharon too. People normally get a chance to turn their lives around, and Sharon didn't get that chance. But at the same time, the mom in me is really bothered by the two kids, and my impression from what was written about it is that it's just so much more sad that they're the ultimate victims in this case. A little girl who carries her mother's number around in a purse as a 10 or 12-year-old, at least if my child was typical, that's not normal to have a purse with you at that age, not consistently. This makes me think that she was probably hoping for her mom to call her first. She didn't use it, but she wanted it. And in addition to Kimberly, there's a little boy who's reaching out to his mom's family again and again, trying for some sort of connection to his mother. They didn't appear to stay in his life any more than his mom did. The uncle knew the kids existed, but not where they were. And it sounds like once he got a hold of his grandfather, they didn't stay in contact either. It's just really sad to think about. And I'm glad that they had a father that was involved and wanted them. In all of these families, it's often the kids looking for the missing parent. As for Michael, he would tell a reporter that he still thought of his mom, saying he always thought that maybe she had started a new family somewhere. He was shocked to find out she'd been in Virginia the whole time. He believes she likely got mixed up with the wrong people. Her daughter would say she's hopeful they find who did it. The police are still hoping, now that they have Sharon's name, that they can solve who took her life. She sounds like a lost soul whose life maybe just spiraled. If anyone has any information on her movements, please call the number on the screen. Sharon Abbott Lane went unidentified for 27 years. Beaufort County Jane Doe, identified as Maria Gonzalez. On May 24, 1995, in Yemassee, South Carolina, a transportation department employee was mowing grass along Cotton Hall Road. As he was mowing near a drainage ditch, he came upon a young woman near the intersection of Cotton Hall and Old Sheldon Road. From the best I can tell, State Road S748 is called Cotton Hall Road. The woman found hadn't had her life taken in that spot. Someone transported her there 12 to 24 hours before she was found. She had curly brown hair that had been dyed a reddish color. She was possibly biracial or Hispanic. She had a baby by cesarean section, a full hysterectomy, and a 3-inch scar from thyroid surgery. The underwear found with her was mostly sold in Latin American countries, and this is in part why they believe she might be Latina. It was eventually determined she'd been asphyxiated 12 to 24 hours before, and she was probably 28 to 35 and around 5'4". They knew she'd passed away on her back and was found lying on her face. She was left wearing nothing but her underwear. They would search for decades as to what her name was, but it would take forensic genealogy to get the result, leading to her son in December of 2022. She was identified as Maria Gonzalez of Kissimmee, Florida. She was a 36-year-old mother of 3 when she disappeared. It turns out her family long believed she'd walked away, and because of this, they didn't report her missing. The police have described the assault and death as up close and personal, and they're currently looking for her friend and the boyfriend she had at the time. For nearly 30 years, her children believed that she chose to walk away, and their lives formed around that disappointment. One article later said that the children had only been told part of the story. We do know that right before she disappeared, she had returned home from a visit to Puerto Rico. She was at home with her husband and the kids had gone to school that day. When they came home, she was gone. 2 photos were released to the media. A photo of a male who is described in some articles as a boyfriend, and the other of an identified friend. It's unclear of who the man was to her or anything about her husband at the time. The police are asking the public to come forward if they know who this man is. Unfortunately, the photo itself isn't great. The other photo is of her close female friend. It's believed her name may be Patricia, but they're not positive that this is true. The authorities did do an age progression, and the purpose of these photos are that they need more information in order to figure out who took Maria's life. The police desperately need to interview them in order to discover what her movements were at the time. I've never seen this before, but the family and children are represented by legal counsel and not speaking. If anyone has any information at all on what might have happened to Maria or the location of the 2 people photographed here, please contact the number on your screen. Maria Gonzalez went unidentified for 27 years. The Essex County Jane Doe, identified as Nancy Fitzgerald. Someone was walking along a stretch of the Hudson Trail in the Atlantic Highlands in 1988. This person would find someone who it would turn out had been missing since 1972. It's pretty amazing if you think about it, found after 16 years. She finally had a chance for a name and a family to know what happened to her. But it's a reminder that anytime anyone's hiking or out and about, it's really important to pay attention and not dismiss something as being impossible. So many of these people are found completely by accident. There are likely so many more of these situations where people aren't found. About 600,000 people go missing every year, and 90% of those are found or identified. That sounds pretty good until you consider this leaves about 60,000 people a year, and that's in the US only. Thanks to technology, we identify them a lot easier now, but still not everyone is found. Additionally, nearly 5,000 unidentified people are found annually, according to NamUs. In this case, we are talking about the Hudson Trail in the Atlantic Highlands. The Henry Hudson Trail is a rail trail in Monmouth County, New Jersey. It's a long trail, about 24 miles. In this case, local residents were trying to clear a portion of that trail in order to offer a bicycle trail along the beach. It was 1988, and there, on a wooded hillside that leads to the beach, was what the person gathering garbage originally thought to be a plastic ball, but it was not. The incredible thing about this is a botanist would estimate that she'd been there 15 years, and that was incredibly accurate. It's actually pretty amazing how close a lot of these come. It depends on how much experience and the education, I imagine, of the person making the estimates, but this one was spot on. They determined it to be a woman who'd passed away, likely wearing knee-high socks, a bra, and platform sandals. They estimated her age between 15 and 20, and that she was 5 foot tall to 5'4". Nancy Fitzgerald was 16 when she sat down with her family for Easter dinner, which they list as April 2nd, 1972. Unbeknownst to her family, it was the last family dinner they would all attend together. The next day, she disappeared, and no one knew why or where she went. The police have put out a plea for information. A local prosecutor made a statement to the press saying, "While we are encouraged the identification was made, this is ultimately a puzzle that will remain unfinished until we locate that final piece, the circumstances behind Nancy's death. We are urging anyone who has any information to please come forward." Ms. Fitzgerald's peers would likely be in their 60s today, so we firmly believe that it's not too late to determine what happened to her and why, and hold any living person accountable. It's not even known what the cause of death was. It puts the police at such a disadvantage, but she deserves justice and somebody knows something. You can always call into Crime Stoppers and remain anonymous. The number for Crime Stoppers is found on the screen. Nancy Fitzgerald was missing for nearly 51 years. She went unidentified as a Jane Doe for 34. While she was just 16 then, she would be 67 years old today. The Owenton County Jane Doe, identified as Linda Bennett. On May 6, 1988, a couple was on their way to buy a newspaper, and they were walking along Highway 330, 18 miles south of Owenton, in Owen County, Kentucky. And it was here that they found a partially clothed woman who was only wearing brown men's socks. They estimated her to be around 25 to 40 with brown hair. She was around 5'5" and 120 pounds. She had an amateur tattoo on her upper right arm that said Steve. Near her was a nylon blouse and a pair of men's Winner's Choice brand tennis shoes in a 5.5, which I can tell you from my own feet that this is about a size 7 in women's. There were broad jeans and a nylon blouse nearby, not on her. The strangest thing was part of her left hand was missing. She'd been asphyxiated, and based on the circumstances, it's believed she was a victim of SA. As they investigated, they began to believe she either had ties to Columbus, Ohio, or southern Florida. The police worked the case hard, and they utilized the publicity of what happened while making a plea for people to come forward, but nobody ever did. A witness believed they saw her walking along the freeway, not far from a diner that was popular with truckers who passed by. It's possible she ended up there the same way, after hitching a ride with somebody. Unfortunately, this was the only tip, and there's no way to even know if the woman found was the same one seen walking. In 2019, Parabon Nanolabs offered to take on the case, and DNA testing was funded by a grant providing aid to victims. It was lucky they had hair samples taken before she was buried, because like way too many before her that I've covered here, she was placed in an unmarked grave and they lost the location. It makes me wonder how many aren't so lucky and we don't even hear about it, that they just walk away from trying to identify the person. Because after all, you can't test DNA without their DNA. I've also covered on here quite a few where bones disappeared from storage or they were found in storage. One time they were found at a university. I don't know, just people shouldn't be tucked into storage. In this case, it was a stroke of luck that they were able to get usable DNA, and with that, Linda Bennett once again had her name. She's believed to be a victim of Samuel Little, and here is the picture he did of her. I've mentioned Little before. He claims to have taken 93 lives, and, even more horrifying, the police believe that he was being truthful. Unlike many of these perpetrators, he is described as personable by those in the prison system. Not just was he a sociopath, he was considered to be a genius, and he did have a knack for remembering information about how many people he robbed of their lives. As evil and awful as he was, a lot of that information that he gave has led to identifications and knowing who was at fault. Clara Birdlong, for instance, introduced him as a boyfriend to her family. He targeted women who were at risk, living somewhat on the fringe of society, and likely his affable personality led to attracting these women in the first place. Many of these women were suffering from addiction or were estranged from their family. Linda Bennett would have been 70 years old had he allowed her to live. She went unidentified for 32 years and was found just 158 miles away from home. The Decatur Jane Doe, identified as Wanda Floyd. Wanda Floyd would find herself being taken by ambulance to Decatur General Hospital in Decatur, Alabama, on July 15, 2020, from the 2900 block of Jefferson Street in Cortland, Alabama. It's not clear what was wrong with the 60-year-old woman, but she found herself in distress. After treatment, got a ride back to Cortland, which is about 20 minutes away. 16 days later, a fisherman at Flint Creek in Morgan County would report to 911 that he found the remains of a woman on July 31st, 2020. DNA was collected and sent for analysis, but no match was made in the database. At some point after she disappeared, her identification and Medicaid card were found on the corner of Rosa Street and Harold Washington in Cortland, Alabama. After this, none of her checks that were mailed to her were cashed, and this was considered out of character. The estimate for the Jane Doe was pretty wide, 25 to 50, and the recreation looked nothing like Wanda. But still there were suspicions that the Jane Doe was in fact Wanda Floyd. It would take 2 years and funding from a philanthropist named Carly Davis. She's funded a lot of these cases. And in December of 2020, Wanda again had her name. No one knows how she ended up there, and the police are looking for information on the case. Wanda Floyd went unidentified for 2.5 years. The Rosharon John Doe, identified as Robin Dewaine Mangrum. In 2005, Texas authorities in Liverpool, Texas, were notified that a 34-year-old man named Robin Mangrum had gone missing. The man was a father of 2 who was last seen at a Chevron gas station in Rosharon, which is about 15 miles from Liverpool. According to Robin's mother, his father knew within a week of him disappearing that Robin Mangrum was gone for good. They always believed he met with foul play, and that they may never know what happened to him. What they did not know is that a man was found by hunters in 2020 in the woods of Rosharon. It looks like very little was reported about those remains, but they were likely using genetic genealogy to try to place who that person had been. It would take 2 years until November of 2021, but they would finally have an answer to that question, thanks to the North Texas Center for Human Identification. Robin's mother, especially, had been suffering for over 15 years.
Mangrum's father died in 2017 without ever having closure. His son and daughter are now in their early 20s and just learning that their father is dead. Officials told family his cause of death was inconclusive, but Walton says she believes he was murdered.
They shouldn't have done that to him. I mean, it's just, I don't know, I miss him so much.
Walton says her son battled with drugs, but he was a kind man who always made time for family.
Another woman had been found in that same area. Robin's mother is clear that she believes that someone did this, and that it's related to the remains of the other woman found in that same area. So far, there's zero proof the 2 cases are related. Anyone with information in Robin's disappearance is asked to contact the Brazoria County Sheriff's Office at the number on the screen. Robin Mangrum was a missing person for 17 years. He went unidentified as a John Doe for 2. If Robin had lived, he would be 51 today. The Long Beach John Doe, identified as Kenneth Williams. At about 4:30 a.m. on June 3, 1978, a young male was found facing the ground in a prone position at the intersection of Division and Corona Street in Long Beach, California. He was unresponsive, and after emergency personnel came to the scene, he would be pronounced deceased. Later, it would be stated that he'd OD'd. It was announced that he'd likely also been thrown from a car. However, an autopsy would later change the cause of death to asphyxiation. None of this, however, helped with who he was. It was clear he had likely attended some kind of party or event, possibly at a local bar, as he had a paid stamp on the top of his hand. The confusing part of this was that he was clearly below the drinking age, which at the time was 18. Internet sleuths had been trying to figure out who the man was, and they would suggest Randy Kraft as who possibly took his life. He's believed to be responsible for 16 young men from 1973 to 1980. And that number has suggested to be as high as 80. The articles I'm seeing speak a lot about this theory, but absent any proof, that's the most I'm going to say. They knew the man had hazel eyes, a slender build, and freckles. It would turn out he was 3 years shy of the 18-year drinking age. Time would go from 1973 all the way to December of 2022. 44 years his family would go without knowing what happened to him. Turns out he was missing from La Puente, California, and he was found in Long Beach, about 30 miles away. I'm not sure if he was officially reported missing. The people at the time when he was found believed he was possibly a transient. So it's possible they didn't know for sure that he went missing. I will provide an editor's note if anything more comes up on this case. The police would confirm that Kenneth last attended Sierra Vista Middle School in 1977, and he was enrolled in Fairgrove Academy on August 18, 1977. He last attended school on October 27, 1977. He was found on June 3, 1978, which means he likely wasn't in school half of that school year. It's possible that he was a runaway. Kenneth Nevada Williams went unidentified for 44 years. Had he lived, he would be 59 today. The Beaver Creek John Doe, 1981, identified as Louis Gitano. This case starts out in Beaver Creek Township, Minnesota. While clearing out a concrete culvert at I-90 and Rocky City Road 23, a Department of Transportation worker happened upon skeletal remains. The ditch and culvert had last been cleared on October 21, 1980, and no remains were found at that time, at least none that were reported. The reason this is a little sketchy and matters is that the remains would turn out to be from a man who was missing in 1971, a decade earlier than he was found. Thanks to the DNA Doe Project, in December of 2022, Louis Gitano once again had his name. Louis was 25 when he was last seen, but as mentioned, he was last seen in 1971. It was not Minnesota he went missing from either. He was last seen in Omaha, Nebraska. How he traveled those 200 miles and if he was alive when that happened is a complete mystery. The weird thing, however, is that the skeleton was wearing clothes. He had on green work pants, boxer shorts, green socks, and a light tan engineer-type boots. He had with him a small locket with the photo of a baby inside. The cause of his passing was a GS wound to his head. It doesn't seem logical that a decade could have passed with him still wearing his clothing and him having been moved there from somewhere else. So likely whoever was supposed to be cleaning that culvert annually wasn't doing so. According to the examination, he was 30 to 50 years old and approximately 5'7". There's always the possibility, however, that maybe the people had been cleaning that culvert and he was somewhere else for those 9 years. It's not clear if they had any sort of estimate for how long he'd been there. Investigators are urging that anyone who recognizes or had contact with him between 1971 and 1981, please contact the Sheriff's Tip Line at area code 507-283-5000. Louis went unidentified for 41 years, and he was missing for 51. The Gateway John Doe, identified as Larry Dean Watts. Larry Watts was 48 when he went missing from Grand Junction, Colorado, on June 16, 1997. His family reported him missing, but never knew what happened to him. They hoped against hope that he was okay somewhere and that they would see him again. There would be no movement on his case, and 22 years would pass before they finally knew who he was. He would be identified in December of 2022. We now know that he was found in Gateway, Colorado, when hunters stumbled upon his remains. He perished due to a self-inflicted GS wound. The item used to take his life was still there, along with a flashlight, a holster, a cigarette lighter, Camel cigarettes, eyeglasses, socks, sandals, and a wine glass. While it doesn't tell them why, and it's not the answer that they wanted, his family now finally knows what happened to him. Larry Dean Watts was missing for 25 years, and an unidentified John Doe for 3. The Carbon County John Doe, identified as Rogers Lee Ellis. A man was found in an area that I'm really familiar with and is probably one of the most beautiful areas of Montana, in my opinion. Before we dig in, I want to give you a little bit of background on this area. Red Lodge is a mountain town, and its only real street is Main Street, like many of the small towns in Montana. In this case, there are about 10,000 people who live in Carbon County, and the main city of that county is Red Lodge. It's beautiful, but it's a very expensive town. It's an area where people normally go to ski or fish, camp, and hike. And there's lots of little touristy shops like Pizza at Bogart's and unique collectibles often made in Montana. It's also really close to a lot of areas where someone could end up and not be found. Unfortunately, it's a great area to get rid of someone. It is a zigzag of roads and lots of mountains. There's a lot of frequently covered paths, and there are little side roads all over the place. In June of 2004, a hiker would discover the skull of a human about 15 miles south of Red Lodge. A search would find a femur and a pelvic bone. Since so little was found, it was pretty limited as to what they could even know. They thought he was likely between 15 and 32, and they were able to extract some DNA. But this isn't the type that we talk about now, the type that genealogy is based on. However, if his family had submitted their DNA to CODIS through the NamUs website, he would have been found a lot earlier. So if anybody is missing a member of their family, make sure that DNA is submitted there. You can see in the links below this video, links to different things you can do with DNA to help identify John and Jane Does, whether it's someone you're missing personally or not. In this case, they actually thought that he was female. The recreations were obviously completely wrong, and then new ones were submitted. In 2022, with the assistance of the U.S. Department of Justice, the FBI, and NamUs, as well as the Missoula Sheriff's Office, helped the Carbon County office to submit to Othram Labs. Othram has come up with more than any other labs in the recent year for identifications covered by this channel. They did it again through genetic genealogy, and they gave Rogers Ellis his name back. While his name was actually Rogers, he went by the name of Roger, and he was born in Wisconsin Rapids in 1954. It would turn out that while he was found in 2004, he had likely been there for 30 years. In 1976, Roger was facing some legal issues because of a marijuana possession arrest, heading to a state where, ironically, marijuana would be legal by the time he was identified. Roger was so in fear of legal consequences that he told his family he was going to leave to avoid jail, suggesting he might not return. So when he didn't return, they didn't know what to think. It's not hard to believe they might think he was out there living his own life. But sadly, he wasn't. They believe now that he hitchhiked from Wisconsin in December of 1976, traveling with someone who ended up bringing him to Montana and dumping him off while they probably traveled on their way. Currently, the sheriff's office needs to help trace Roger's travels back to 1976. If anyone has any idea at all what happened to Roger or where he was, please call the number on your screen. Rogers Ellis was missing for 46 years and an unidentified John Doe for 18. The Pickaway John Doe, identified as Robert Mullins. Robert Mullins was 21 when he went missing between November of 1988 and November of 1989. He was also only 5'3", which is an unusual height for a man. And there is a reason I mention this before anything else, because it was this fact that would hamper his identification for years. In 1991, hunters would locate the remains of a woman that was 5'1" to 5'4", who was discovered in a shallow grave. They believed her to be Native American, and for the following 21 years, up until 2012, when her remains were tested, they were looking for someone of the wrong sex. It wasn't until 2012 the DNA was done and they would discover that she was a he. They had been searching all those years based on an incorrect assumption, misunderstanding all of the facts, all based on height. But now they had the basics correct, and there was hope that the very thing that impacted the incorrect identification as a woman, that this one specific fact might help identify him. Yet there were no men listed within his high range, so it still didn't lead to his name. In 2019, they requested assistance extracting DNA for advanced testing. This would then go on for nearly a full year. On November 1st of 2022, which is exactly 31 years from the discovery of his remains, authorities would believe they finally knew who the man was. And the announcement was made in December of 2022. The Attorney General, Dave Yost, would say it well. What a tragedy to die unknown, to not have a name to put on a memorial. Today, that circle closes. If anyone has any information, please help give Robert Mullins the one remaining thing he deserves the most, and help identify who did this. Robert Mullins was 21 when he went missing. It would take 2 years for his remains to be found, and another 31 to discover his name. He went unidentified longer than he spent alive on Earth. Had he lived, he would be 54 today. The Saginaw County John Doe, 1973, identified as Daniel Garza Gonzalez. This starts with the Saginaw River, which is located in Zilwaukee Township, Saginaw County, Michigan. On March 13, 1973, a man was found floating in the river, and he had been there perhaps about a month. He was likely white or Hispanic, dressed in a green sweater, brown pants, and red flannel long underwear. He also had heavy socks. He was likely 25 to 35 and around 5'9", with wavy brown hair. The cause was a GS wound inflicted before he was placed in the river. His name and who he was would elude authorities for almost 5 decades, saying it was especially challenging because he was from an underrepresented population, complicated by the custom of marrying only within the limits of a local community, clan, or tribe. This was in reference to DNA available in GEDmatch currently. I actually ran into this in person a while back. One of my friends successfully adopted 3 siblings who were of Native descent, after originally just fostering the youngest. In order to fully adopt them, she had to prove that she had Native American blood, even if just 1% for it to be approved. But it turns out that as a community, they've been pushed not to provide DNA to these companies, probably for very real and good reasons. I won't get into that now. It's not what matters, but what does matter is that had an impact on her ability to prove that she was able to adopt the kids. So it's a real thing, and it can affect a lot of different populations. So this is also why it's really important to consider uploading your DNA to GEDmatch or Family Tree DNA to make it searchable for cases like this. If you want information on how to do so, check the description below. So for these circumstances, it meant that 65% of unidentified persons in the NamUs database are unidentified people of color, which I didn't realize until this case. And within this, these are a lot of the underrepresented communities. It's also a reminder that there are a number of John and Jane Does that are being searched for right now that got put on hold because there isn't close enough DNA in the database to help find who they were. In this case, they had only some distant cousins, but people would step up and offer their DNA in order to get closer, and it worked. On January 5th, 2023, it was announced that Daniel Garza Gonzalez once again had his name. It turns out he was found just 2 days before his 29th birthday. Daniel was a Vietnam War vet, and after serving our country and managing to make it out in one piece, someone cut his life short here. The police officer would actually describe him as being knocked down, shot, and discarded. In addition to 7 GS wounds, he had suffered blunt force trauma. His family was left to wonder where he went. He had left his family in Fort Worth, Texas, and moved to Flint, Michigan to find work. His family never heard from him again. It was somewhere along his move that he disappeared, and they weren't sure where. Daniel Gonzalez went unidentified for 49 years. Had he lived, he would be 79 today. The Yakima County Jane Doe, identified as Daisy Mae Tallman Heath. There isn't much noted about how the Jane Doe was found, but we know that it was in November of 2008 when a woman was found near White Swan, which is located in Yakima County, Washington. As a result, the Yakima Nation Tribal Police would find themselves working hard in coordination with the Yakima County Coroner's Office in hopes of identifying the skeletal remains and what her name was. It would turn out later that the remains had likely been outside in the elements for over 21 years before they were found, which likely made it all that much harder to match. The coroner would pronounce her as being deceased 7 years after her disappearance. Her family was frustrated by what they considered a lackluster assistance by the police in trying to find her. Her remains were located on the Yakima Reservation in 2008, and quickly they began to suspect it was Daisy. But without the DNA to confirm it, there was no way to prove who she was. The coroner's office would try to get a DNA profile from her remains, but it couldn't be done successfully using traditional methods. The Yakima County Coroner's Office was able to send her remains directly to Othram in order to employ some of their special techniques that have identified so many cases lately. And it worked. They were successfully able to extract some usable DNA. It was with this, in January of 2023, that Daisy Mae Tallman Heath once again had her name, and her family finally knows what happened to her. Although in this case her cause of death hasn't been reported. Daisy was a member of the Confederated Tribes and Bands of Yakima Nation. She grew up as the youngest of 6 girls. She was raised by her maternal grandparents with the assistance of 2 older sisters on a ranch in Medicine Valley, near the foothills of the Cascades. She excelled as an athlete and played basketball and baseball when she was in high school. She made her money by making pipes and doing paintings that she sold to others. She was described by family and friends as being spunky and fearless, though at the same time she was on the quiet side. In 1988, Daisy gave birth to a daughter she would name Sherry, after a sister of hers that had passed away. She was so excited to be a mother, but then her daughter would suddenly pass away due to SIDS. Not long after this, Daisy's grandmother passed away, which made her depression that much worse. She began to struggle some and would find herself traveling between the White Swan area of Washington, where she disappeared from, and the Warm Springs Reservation in Oregon. It's reported that she had developed a habit of going missing off and on, but not for long periods of time. She came back pretty quick after doing what was described as going off-grid. And she was strong and resourceful, and she could actually survive in the mountains by hunting, fishing, and gathering food for small stretches at a time. She was described as being very good at this. So when she wasn't where she was expected to be at the time she was expected there, her family wasn't overly concerned, at least not at first. But she had never disappeared for more than a week or 2 at a time. So when she didn't come back after this, it was a concern. But because of her habits of disappearing occasionally, she wouldn't be reported missing for 2 months. The last time she was seen by her family, she was 29, and the year was 1987. Because she was gone longer than normal, her family had started to worry. Eventually, her keys and backpack were found in a closed area of the reservation known as Soda Springs, and everybody started worrying just all that much more. Her family would struggle for the next 2 decades until the unidentified remains were found, and then they struggled for 14 more years until DNA could prove what her family believed was true, that they had in fact found Daisy. One resource lists foul play as a suspected cause, but with so many years passing, it's difficult to try to prove anything. If anyone saw her or knows anything about what might have happened, please call the number on your screen. Daisy Tallman Heath was born in January of 1958 and identified in January of 2023. She was missing for 35 years and was an unidentified Jane Doe for 14. If Daisy had survived, she would be 65 years old today. The Hillsborough County Jane Doe, 1971. Identified as Catherine Ann Alston. Kathy Alston lived a pretty good life in Boston, Massachusetts, at least up until 1971. She had attended Boston University, marrying young, but by 26 she was divorced, although those who know her say this wasn't acrimonious. She wasn't having any difficulty at all with her ex. In fact, they would say she hadn't had problems with anyone. Her family had decided as a group to move to Texas, and up until that point, she was living with a roommate. She would make the decision that she too was going to move with them. Everyone packed up and they bought tickets, and they would arrive at the airport. Everyone, that is, except for Kathy. She didn't show up, and her family would never see or hear from her again. Something must have happened to her around the time she was to leave for the airport, and the thing her family didn't know was that her remains would be found on October 6, 1971, at the end of Kilton Road in Bedford, New Hampshire. This was in a Manchester suburb located near the highway bypass. It was estimated she'd been there 1 to 3 months. There is a statement in one of the articles regarding this case that Kathy was never reported missing. I feel like I need to say that I no longer take this at face value, and I don't think anyone else should. In a case like this, it would be odd that she wasn't reported missing, especially when she had tickets and didn't show. It appears that quite often family will say that they gave a missing person report and there's no record of it. It disappeared over the years. So I suspect that according to the record, no one reported her missing meaning they don't have any proof she was reported missing. Not so much that it didn't happen. The missing person reports at the time were on paper, and over years, they just seemed to disappear in many different jurisdictions. Additionally, if they had reported her missing, it was probably her parents, who are no longer alive and can't be asked. So I just want to be clear, there might be a discrepancy between this video and what's written out there. We do know that the police had tried many times in order to try to identify her, and there are 3 distinctly different recreations of what she could have looked like. This case might actually have been solved years ago, if not for a change that happened at GEDmatch. It turns out that the police had turned to genetic DNA, and so did one of Kathy's siblings. That sibling purchased a test and then uploaded it to GEDmatch, and I would be shocked if some of the reason she did it wasn't partially in hopes of finding out what happened to Kathy. However, GEDmatch made a change in their policy and took all of the existing DNA samples and marked it as not being able to be searched for. Anyone who had uploaded their GEDmatch for this would have to have come back in, logged in, and ticked the box that said it was okay to search the DNA. It had been changed so that you had to opt in. And unfortunately, Kathy's sister didn't do this. As a result, that pool to search through shrunk massively, and it's my understanding they tried with no results and ended up putting the search aside for a later date. A few years would pass and GEDmatch would pivot again and allow for searching. So just recently, when those covering her case checked again, they would discover that there was in fact updated matches. And Kathy's sister's DNA kit would provide the answer that they needed. As of January 9th, 2023, Kathy again had a name. The police are asking for assistance. Kathy had a roommate named David Cormier, and they lived on Beacon Street across from Boston Common. The police need to speak to him in order to obtain information about Kathy's movements. Anyone with information about Cormier, who likely lives in Boston, Dorchester, or Somerville, or did at one point, or also Kathy's movements herself, it is asked that you contact authorities at the number on the screen. Kathy Alston went unidentified for 51 years. Had she lived, she would be 77 years old today. The New England Vampire, identified as John Barber. This is a strange one, and it's also the oldest Doe case that I've ever covered. But it's also pretty fascinating, and it's different. And at the same time, this man is really a John Doe, and he deserved to have his name restored. In the 1990s, 3 boys were playing near a sand gravel pit in Griswold, Connecticut. It was there suddenly they would discover a human skull. It was pretty clear right away that this was a much older than expected skeleton. Additionally, it was clear what had been done to his remains had to do with a belief that he may have been a vampire. It put them in a strange spot with the goal to rebury with respect, but how do you do that without a name? It was believed the man passed away in the 1800s, which of course posed a huge challenge. So let's start with what was done to him. Everybody knows about the Salem witch trials, which I know I was obsessed with when I was in junior high. This isn't that, but what happened is similar. The hysteria involving this case also involves New England. In this case, it started with tuberculosis. There was a huge breakout of TB in the 19th century. You will often hear this referred to as consumption, which I actually hadn't until I watched The Vampire Diaries years ago. I remember it being referred to on there, and I'm sure it's in other shows. And what that actually was tuberculosis. And what they believed was that it was the deceased consuming the life of surviving relatives. It's crazy to think of how a lack of information formed horrible things, but TB is horrible. It's a terrible way to die. The people who came down with it would suffer horrible coughs and debilitating pain in their lungs. Essentially, it was untreatable until the 1940s, when a treatment was finally developed. By 1949, they were able to truly start saving people. But back then, 1 of 7 people in existence died from TB. It was a huge number, and it was bad. By the late 1800s, it's estimated that 70 to 90% of those living in cities would end up developing TB. And of those, 80% would pass away from this. So it's understandable why there was such a panic. The richer Americans who could afford it were cared for in tuberculosis sanitariums, which was also an experiment to isolate the sick. But because they didn't really understand the disease, they couldn't really find a way to stop the spread, and they didn't. TB kept spreading. Sometimes blood would come out of people's mouths, and that added to the suspicion and the fear. Back then, they didn't understand the concept of germs or how they spread. Surgeons didn't even begin scrubbing their hands before surgery until the 1870s. So when this man lived, it was in the mid to late 1800s. And TB was claiming the lives of entire families in Rhode Island, Connecticut, Vermont, and other parts of the East Coast. Because this illness was seen as sucking the life out of them, it was called consumption. So once the person passed from this illness, to stop it from spreading, people would panic and dig up bodies and burn them or pull them apart. People did all sorts of strange rituals. They were afraid and wanted some sort of answer to make the suffering stop. Nearby Rhode Island was known as the vampire capital of America at one point, according to the History Channel. That said, this isn't like the Salem witch trials, and they didn't believe that vampires were walking among them. Or at least most didn't. They were not treating the sick badly or as if they were vampires. It was just after they had passed, because so many were sick that they tried to prevent others from getting it. And when they examined the John Doe's remains, they would discover that he had been hacked and his spine had been disconnected. His chest had been broken open. It was determined he had been in the ground for 5 years before that ever even happened. Which is interesting why after 5 years they felt there was a sudden danger. When our John Doe was first found in the 1990s, DNA wasn't as advanced, and they were pretty much stuck for what to do. Without being able to test him the way we take for granted now, they couldn't know for sure, even though most of the pieces were there. They did the best they could, and they put it aside for technology to catch up. And obviously it did. As DNA progressed, they used his Y chromosome to trace him and came up with a genealogical study that would eventually narrow it down to a farmer named John Barber, who was born in 1788, and the man would pass away in 1842. They could tell that whoever the man was, he had a lot of arthritis, and the pattern of it would suggest he was a hard-working farmer, which was a pretty common occupation at the time. They even found an obituary from 1826. It had been written for a 12-year-old named Nicholas Barber, naming the young man as being born to a father named John Barber. And this helped to suggest they were on the right track. It was believed that John Barber worked hard in his life. The arthritis showed this to be true. Sadly, he would succumb to tuberculosis like so many others, and the coffin found nearby helped to further confirm things. It had the inscription NB13, likely belonging to Nicholas Barber. What was found was actually on what would later be considered the Walton family burial ground. We know that when he was 24, he served in the War of 1812. His widow, Hannah, must have survived, as it's reported she would make a claim for his pension after John had passed. They had 3 boys in total, including the one that was found buried near him. It turns out that the remains found were just part of what was there. It's believed 29 people were buried there, 7 men, 7 women, 12 children, and 3 infants, which is heartbreaking in its own way. Living through adulthood happened so much less often then. The hidden burial ground was mainly used from 1740 to 1830. Given kids were playing in the area, it's likely there were no markings. It's stated that they believed John Barber was an itinerant farmer, meaning he probably didn't have his own farm but traveled to where he would work or wherever someone needed him. So it suggests that maybe the town blamed him for an epidemic that happened later. Because of the way they were doing things back then, it's likely in 1847 that the entire town attended what was done to John. It was normal at the time to celebrate the desecration of the remains with the belief that it would help them not succumb to what he had died from. They found an empty coffin nearby that said JB55 on it. So they had pulled our poor John Doe from what should have been his final resting place. After they desecrated his remains, they reburied him face down with his hands crossed at his chest. In Griswold, Connecticut, our John Doe was not the only suspected vampire. After John, we know that at least one other family was afflicted with TB, and when the 2 parents passed away from consumption, their 2 adult sons would do to them what was done to John Barber, and it was publicized in the local newspaper. Parabon Nanolabs gave the 55-year-old man a face. John was born 235 years ago and passed away 180 years ago. In a strange twist of fate, John Barber would go unidentified for 32 years. The Jonesport John Doe, identified as Philip Kahn. This is a really strange one. Philip was 84 when he flew from Las Vegas to New York, and then he seemingly vanished into thin air. This was in July of 2000. The same month, on July 24th, 2000, the partially skeletonized remains of an unidentified male were found. But these remains were not in New York. They were instead found floating in the Atlantic Ocean between Maine and Canada. He was found about 27 nautical miles away from Jonesport, Maine. They were able to identify a number of medical conditions in the man, such as heart issues and moderate emphysema. He was around 6'2", and his age was estimated as 60 to 65. It would not be until January of 2023 that his name was known, although there was an early try by Parabon Nanolabs. It wasn't a short journey. Parabon became involved in 2019, and they were able to discover his heritage included Ashkenazi Jewish roots, but there weren't any matches that were close enough to identify him. In March of 2022, the FBI began using a special program to identify fingerprints in the case of matches that weren't easily made before. It was able to clear up some of the difficulties in getting a full print. although this is really strange considering it's described as skeletonized. Also, he hadn't been in the water very long, so I suspect that's an incorrect statement in the article. Either way, the FBI's attempt worked, and they would arrive at Philip Kahn's name. Unfortunately, it still doesn't offer much of a picture for his family. It turns out the age estimate was off by 20 years, but truthfully, given his location, I can't imagine it would have made a difference if they were closer. It's highly unlikely his age had anything to do with him not being identified. We know that Philip was 84 when he left Las Vegas and landed in New York City. How he ended up in the water itself is a mystery, and they need someone to come forward with information if anyone knows what might have happened. Philip Kahn went unidentified for 22 years. The Lake Michigan Jane Doe, 1997, identified as Dorothy Ricker. On October 24, 1997, a woman was found in Lake Michigan against the breakwall in Manistee, Michigan. She was pretty tall, 5'11" and around 200 pounds. They didn't find her name, but they did find an appendectomy scar and an orthodontic bracket on her front teeth. They estimate she was possibly 20 to 60, which is likely too wide to be helpful. Investigators tried to find leads, but nothing happened and it went cold. Investigators tried again in 2020, asking the DNA Doe Project to help, but they found this to be a long process. The Michigan State Police would partner with the project, and they too would hit a wall. The process of getting usable DNA was difficult, but they did it, although it took over a year for them to extract and process usable DNA. But they did it thanks to Astria Forensics. The fortunate part of this is when they uploaded to GEDmatch, they found a close match pretty quickly. The DNA Doe Project eventually contacted the daughter of Dorothy Ricker, requesting her DNA. Her daughter would provide not just a DNA sample, but news articles of when her mom went missing. Dorothy was officially identified in December of 2022. On October 7, 1997, the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel had run an article about Dorothy when she was reported missing. At that time, some boaters in St. Francis would report seeing a body in the lake, but it disappeared by the time the police arrived. The article would explain that Dorothy was upset with family members who tried to get her mental health assistance. The article would also explain that on 8 a.m., Thursday, October 2nd, 1997, Dorothy ran out of gas and was given a ride by a sheriff's deputy, who also gave her $10 to fill up her tank with gas. It was later that day officers reported seeing her on the lake, but this was in Wisconsin. It does look like if someone could enter the water on one side and end up on the other, that this was probably the case. We know that Dorothy Lynn Ricker was 26 when approached by the two Lake Michigan police officers. There was nothing to identify the woman at the time other than one earring. An autopsy determined her cause of death to be asphyxia due to drowning, and it was ruled as an accident. Although I personally wonder why she would have no clothes on when she was found, if it was an accident, unless of course she was skinny dipping, which is of course possible. Dorothy Ricker went unidentified for 25 years. She was found 265 miles away from where she originally went missing from. Monique Doe, identified as Jennifer McAllister. This case takes place in Brooklyn, New York. A woman's hand was found in the park. She'd been dismembered and was located all throughout Calvert-Vaux Park, in the Gravesend section of Brooklyn, New York. They estimated her at 20 to 45 years old and around 5'3" to 5'9". DNA phenotyping would suggest she was possibly black, with black hair and brown eyes. But because her head wasn't found, it was just a guess based on genetics. They would find 6 distinct portions of her body, with more found in March. There was a tattoo that they believed said Monique, and that is how her nickname came about, assuming that it may have been her legal name in life. Parabon Nanolabs developed a pretty amazing process that establishes what a person might look like, based on their genetics. It's often pretty accurate, and they would find themselves recruited to provide a facial approximation of what the victim may have looked like. Her identity was found using familial DNA, and an article claimed this method was banned shortly after the process, using it to identify possible family links. I looked into it, and all this actually means is that they can't search it through a legal database existing in New York without a judge's approval. They did suspect that they knew who the decedent was. Jennifer McAllister was 33 when she disappeared in 2014. She had a doctor's appointment that was scheduled, but she didn't show up for it. She also had a child whose name was tattooed on her body, but it was not Monique. The tattoo instead said Konique, and this was the name of her son. Konique was 13 when she went missing, and is now 21. He was 3 years older than his brother, who had found himself being raised by his father. It appears he had custody prior to Jennifer even going missing. But as a result, this left Konique feeling abandoned. His brother had family and he did not. It turns out the family tried to report her missing. Her sister, whose name actually is Monique, said that the family was frustrated they weren't allowed to make a report. They were told it couldn't be filed, as she was an adult and not mentally ill. This is a common thread in a lot of these cases, with people not being allowed to be reported missing under the theory they're an adult and they have a right to go missing. There was a theory that she had fallen victim to a state trucker who had been sleeping in his vehicle across an access road off the Belt Parkway. But the reality is that Jennifer lived within a mile of where she was found. So in this case, allowing a missing person report likely would have had her identified almost right away. Monique would explain she was given a phone number to call the authorities. Word traveled pretty quick between them that they believed they had found Jennifer. And after a number of calls back and forth between them, they would realize that what was meant was they had found Jennifer, but she was no longer alive. Hope had swelled and it quickly deflated. Her family would say that once those details were discovered, the goal would shift to finding out who took her life. There is a reward offered through Crime Stoppers. The number to call can be found on the screen at 1-800-577-TIPS. If Jennifer McAllister had lived, she would be 41 today. She was a Jane Doe for 8 years. The Stony Creek Jane Doe, 1987, identified as Linda Jean McClure. In October of 1987, there was a crash on the turnpike near Stony Creek Township when a tractor-trailer rear-ended a semi-truck. The tractor-trailer would catch fire as it was a fuel tank that the semi in front of them was carrying. The two occupants of the tractor-trailer were caught in the fire, and while the driver was identified as 57-year-old Edward Pratt from Fontana, California, the female passenger couldn't be identified. Pratt was working, and he wasn't allowed to have anyone with him without obtaining prior permission, and he'd had none. It was suspected that the woman with him may have been hitchhiking and was perhaps picked up at a nearby truck stop. The authorities entered her into NamUs, but there weren't any possible hits. It would take until August of 2022 that the Pennsylvania Turnpike Commission would approach the idea of forensic genealogy. This is another we owe to the technology of Othram Labs. Thanks to the hard work and an in-house investigation, it would eventually lead to Linda's brother. It was proven that the woman who was in the tractor-trailer was, in fact, Linda Jean McClure, who was 26 at the time the accident happened, and she was from Indiana, Pennsylvania. Her family would share that they last spoke to Linda in the 1980s and confirmed that she had not been reported missing. As with a lot of these cases, people who lived a transient life don't get reported missing because to their family, they're already missing. Finally, her family would have answers. Linda Jean McClure went unidentified for 35 years. Had she lived, she would be 61 today. The Kingman Jane Doe, 1971, also known as Gladys, identified as Colleen Rice. In January of 1971, an unidentified female victim was located in the desert near a dirt road, which was about 2 miles east of U.S. Highway 93 on Hackberry Road. She was found inside a canvas sack that had been tied at the top with white cotton rope. It had words on it that said Deer Pack, Ames, Harris, Neville County, which was printed in green. They believed her to be 35 to 40 and around 5'4" or 162 centimeters tall. She was wearing a U.S. size 14, which in 1971 would have been closer to a size 12, at least in our current sizing. She had orange stretch pants, and on it was a tab reading Symphony, It's What's Happening. This one was in a size 12. Black leather ankle boots and bobby socks, which were likely white. For more than 50 years, investigators have sought her identity. She had expensive dental work, but no matches were made despite sending x-rays various dentists in the area. But no matches were made, and at the time they also checked local hotels and motels. They also compared her to missing person reports in Arizona, California, Nevada, and Utah. But no one matching her description was ever reported missing. For some reason, she wasn't entered into NamUs until November of 2021, which was unfortunate. It moved fast once they had her entered, and Othram Labs funded her DNA through their DNA Solves website, crowdfunding it from people like you and I. Additionally, crowdfunding has been secured to investigate any leads that come up. The Dear Gladys DNA Solves page was advertised and the community opened their heart quickly, funding the case in only 5 days. The testing process began in late 2022. This is one of those that needs the blanks filled in by people who are aware of what she was doing at the time. They know that she was born in 1931 in Portsmouth, Ohio, to James C. Rice and Flossie Truitt. She married a man named William Davis in 1946. Which means she was only 15 when she got married. That would mean she was 39 years old when someone took her life. It turns out the information pretty much stops there. They don't know if Colleen had children, though she may have if she married at 15. That said, things were different in 1946, and many people married young. They are looking for the history of William Davis, and that might be a place to start if anyone knows what happened with her husband, or if they were even together for any amount of time. Her family was estranged, and nobody knows why she was even in Arizona. It's been over 5 decades, but someone still alive will hopefully know more. Colleen Audrey Rice was unidentified for 52 years. If she was still alive, she would be 91 today. The Chicago Jane Doe, March of 2020, identified as Cheyenne Cluse. When Cheyenne was 22, she was last seen at her home on November 27, 2017, in Downers Grove, Illinois. They know that she traveled into Chicago the night of December 1st, but was never heard from again. Cheyenne's family would keep searching for her, but it wasn't until January of 2023 that her identity would come out. Her remains had been found on March 16, 2020. The police are holding back most of the details surrounding her death. Some reports say she was found 5 years ago and others 2. Her family released this statement. As her immediate family, fathers, sisters, brothers, nephews, are in mourning, we ask for privacy as we grieve the unbearable loss of a daughter, sister, aunt, and human being. We plan to hold a private memorial for Cheyenne amongst us, but we hope that everyone can find solace in knowing that she has been found and respectfully laid to rest. The FBI used dental records to identify her. The Cook County Sheriff is investigating her case. Anyone with information is asked to call the number given. Cheyenne Klaus was missing for 5 years. As always, thank you so much for watching. Please consider subscribing and hitting the bell so you don't miss new episodes. So if you enjoy the content here and you're not sure, take a peek to see if you're subscribed. Take care of yourselves and each other.